Right now, Casey Anthony is back in the spotlight after nearly 14 years. She just launched a TikTok account and started a newsletter calling herself a legal advocate.
I am a legal advocate. I am a researcher. I've been in the legal field since 2011.
And that brings us right back to the question that still haunts millions of Americans. How did the woman everyone called the most hated mom in America walk free after her daughter died? Here's what actually happened in that courtroom. Not what the media told you, not what Nancy Grace screamed about every night, what the jury actually heard and saw. Casey Anthony was acquitted because the prosecution couldn't prove she killed Kaylee. And I know that sounds crazy when you think about all the evidence you heard about on TV. But there's a massive difference between what makes good television and what proves guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Let's start with reasonable doubt. This isn't some technicality lawyers use to get guilty people off. It's the foundation of our entire justice system. If you're sitting on a jury and you think, yeah, she probably did it, or even she most likely did it, that's not enough. You have to be convinced to the point where you have no reasonable alternative explanation that makes sense. The prosecution had to prove three things for first-degree murder. One, that Kaylee Anthony was dead. Two, that Casey Anthony killed her. Three, that she did it with premeditation. They proved the first one. Kaylee was definitely dead, but they stumbled hard on the other two. Here's the problem the prosecution faced. They never established how Kaylee died. The medical examiner couldn't determine the cause of death.
I think that is the only logical conclusion based scientifically on some of the scientific information we have, based on observational information we have about homicides and children dying.
After 6 months in the woods, Kaylee's remains were skeletal. No soft tissue, no toxicology, no trauma to the bones. The medical examiner essentially said, "This child is dead, but I can't tell you how she died." But the prosecution went ahead anyway, with a theory that Casey used chloroform and duct tape to kill Kaylee. They spent weeks talking about Casey's internet searches for chloroform. They brought in FBI experts about duct tape. They painted this picture of premeditated murder. And here's where it gets interesting from a legal perspective. The defense didn't have to prove Casey didn't kill Kaylee. They just had to create reasonable doubt about whether she did. Let's talk about the evidence the jury actually saw versus what you saw on TV. The media coverage focused heavily on Casey's behavior. She didn't call the police for 31 days. She was out partying while her daughter was missing. She got a tattoo that said Bella Vita, beautiful life. She lied to investigators repeatedly. All of that looks terrible. But here's the thing, none of that proves she committed murder. The jury was instructed that they couldn't convict based on character evidence or because they didn't like Casey's behavior. They had to focus on whether the evidence proved she killed Kaylee. The prosecution's chloroform theory fell apart under scrutiny. Yes, Casey searched for chloroform online, but the searches happened months before Kaylee died. And experts testified that you can't make deadly chloroform from household products anyway. The FBI found microscopic amounts of chloroform in Casey's car trunk, but experts said that could come from cleaning products. The duct tape evidence was equally problematic. The prosecution claimed Casey put duct tape over Kaylee's mouth and nose to kill her, but the duct tape was found on the skull, not necessarily in the same position it would have been when Kaylee died. The defense argued it could have been placed there later, or could have moved during decomposition, and this is crucial. The prosecution never explained how Casey actually killed Kaylee. Was it the chloroform? The duct tape? Both. They couldn't commit to a specific method because they didn't have evidence for any specific method. The defense presented in an alternative theory. They claimed Kaylee accidentally drowned in the family pool and that Casey and her father, George Anthony, covered it up. Now, you don't have to believe the defense theory for Casey to be acquitted. The jury just has to have reasonable doubt about the prosecution's case. Jose Baez, Casey's defense attorney, hammered this point home in closing arguments. He told the jury, "You cannot convict someone of first-degree murder when you don't know how they died, when they died, where they died." and legally, he was absolutely right. The prosecution tried to fill in the gaps with Casey's suspicious behavior. They argued that only a guilty person would wait 31 days to report their child missing. Only a guilty person would lie to police. Only a guilty person would party while their child was gone. But the defense countered that someone covering up an accident might act the same way. Someone with a history of family dysfunction might panic and lie. Someone dealing with trauma might dissociate and act inappropriately. Here's another crucial point the media often missed. The jury deliberated for less than 11 hours. That's not a lot of time for a death penalty case, but it suggests they weren't agonizing over tiny details. They looked at the big picture and decided the prosecution hadn't met their burden. Several jurors spoke to the media after the trial. They consistently said they thought Casey was probably involved in Kaylee's death somehow, but they couldn't convict her of murder based on the evidence presented. One juror said, "I did not say she was innocent. I just said there was not enough evidence." That's exactly how the system is supposed to work. The jury's job isn't to decide if someone is innocent. It's to decide if the prosecution proved guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Those are two very different standards. The prosecution also faced timeline problems. They couldn't pinpoint when Kaylee died. Casey's phone records and digital footprint were tracked extensively, but there was no smoking gun moment where you could say this is when it happened. The defense exploited these gaps ruthlessly. They pointed out that if you can't prove when someone died, how can you prove who killed them? If you can't prove how someone died, how can you prove it was murder versus an accident? And this brings us to the charges Casey was actually convicted on. The jury found her guilty of 4 misdemeanor counts of lying to police officers. She was sentenced to time served because she'd already spent 3 years in jail awaiting trial. This tells you something important about how the jury viewed the case. They absolutely believed Casey lied. They thought her behavior was suspicious and inappropriate, but lying to police isn't the same as murder, even if the lies are about a missing child. The media narrative around this case was incredibly powerful. Cable news channels devoted hours every day to Casey Anthony coverage. Nancy Grace practically built her career on this case. The public was convinced of Casey's guilt long before the trial started. But juries are supposed to ignore all that. They're supposed to focus only on the evidence presented in court under oath, subject to cross-examination. And when you strip away the media narrative and look at just the courtroom evidence, the prosecution's case had serious holes. This doesn't mean Casey Anthony is innocent. It means the prosecution couldn't prove she was guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. And in America, that's supposed to be enough for an acquittal. Casey Anthony walked free because our system worked the way it's supposed to work. The jury followed their instructions. They applied the law to the facts, and they reached a verdict based on evidence, not emotion. Whether you agree with that verdict or not, understanding how it happened gives you insight into how our legal system actually operates versus how it's portrayed on TV. And right now, with Casey back in the public eye, claiming to be a legal advocate, these lessons are more relevant than ever. Thanks for joining us today at Due Process Daily. Throw us a like and consider subscribing to the channel to help us grow.